In secret, however, we were happy not to serve in the heavy artillery. After the first shots with live ammunition, we also lost all interest in serving with the panzer troops. We witnessed the effect that even a small 3.7 centimetre projectile could have on a practice target. The shell's tungsten core had bored right through the steel target, and the effect on anything behind it was ominous to us. Driving a tank into concentrated fire of a whole anti-tank platoon seemed like suicide. Surviving inside a tank always depended on the thickness of its armour as well as individual luck. Time and again we realised that there was no single spot on the battlefield that offered better chances of surviving the fight than any other. Whether on land, at sea, or in the air, death had all kinds of faces, and your odds were equally good or bad everywhere. The solution offered to us was strict drills and demanding a lot from yourself, which was presented as life-prolonging. We exercised each and every step until it became second nature. Eventually we were dreaming of them, and of course we were brushed up on our infantry training from time to time. A gun crew consisted of 4 men, who all were soon committed to each other and ready to take on all that may come, or so we thought. After training with the gun, some of us were chosen for additional driving lessons. I was one of the lucky few, and earned a licence for motorcycles, passenger cars, as well as trucks. By late April 1941, still during our gun training with the Puck 35-36, we were subject to strict examinations testing our tropical fitness. This gave us an idea of where our first deployment to the front would be. Those who passed would have their trial by fire in Africa, and we wanted it. In fact, our Panzerjäger Ersatzabteilung 33 formed the reserve for Panzerjäger Abteilung 33, 33rd Anti-Tank Battalion, which meant that any losses suffered by Panzerjäger Abteilung 33 were compensated by new recruits from our Ersatz unit at home. After completing their training, the Ersatz was immediately sent to the front. In April 1941, Panzerjäger Abteilung 33 was assigned to the 15 Panzer Division. Originally formed in November 1940 from parts of the 33 Infantry Division, it was shifted to Africa starting April 1941. The first German troops there, commanded by Major General Erwin Rommel, had appeared on February 11, 1941, just days before the beginning of my service. German newsreels had made a big fuzz, and there were rumours about how Rommel had ordered his troops to drive multiple rounds through Tripoli in a big parade in order to make local British spies believe that a much larger force was present. We young soldiers could not know if there was any truth to that rumour, but nevertheless the story was impressive. Starting in early April 1941, the 15 Panzer Division was shipped from Italian Naples across the Mediterranean Sea to Libya. Once there, it was to be deployed at Tobruk, a coastal town staunchly defended by the British and relentlessly attacked by the Germans. Brigadier General Heinrich von Prittwitz und Gaffron, then commander of the 15 Panzer Division, had been killed on April 10th during forward reconnaissance by a direct hit from an Australian anti-tank gun. So, men from a unit like mine, but on the other side, had killed my division's commanding officer even before the unit had arrived in the theatre of war. After us young recruits had figured out which unit's ersatz we were in February 1941, we always watched those parts of the German newsreels concerning developments in Africa with increased interest. After passing the examinations on tropical fitness, we knew full well, we're going to Africa. Africa Corps. After completing my 3-month training, my comrades including, to my great joy, my friend Fritz and I were housed in private quarters at Enkenbach, near Kaiserslautern, Germany. Those were pleasurable circumstances for us, since we were able to escape the daily grind inside the barracks into a civil environment. We were not idle, however, receiving tropical uniforms and a lot of other equipment. The officers, as well as the Spies, meaning the highest-ranking NCO of the company, began making dispositions and organising the preparations for a redeployment to Africa. Getting new uniforms and gear made us sporty, and we had our own little fancy balls. In addition, there were lots of lessons aimed at preparing us for the environmental conditions of the continent, as well as African people and their customs. We learned about scorpions and sandstorms, about Bedouins, and about how much water the human body needs to survive. There were also small booklets handed to us for further reading, containing everything about the lands and peoples of North Africa. And of course we kept moving out to refresh or improve our infantry skills in the field. In May and July 1941, Rommel's lucky star had risen over Africa. My parent unit, Panzerjägerabteilung 33, had been involved in the fighting and suffered its first losses. At that time, the detachment was composed of a headquarters company for logistics, a signal platoon for communications, and 3 Panzerabwehrkompanien. Each of these anti-tank companies consisted of 3 platoons, each fielding 4 37mm PaK 35-36. Due to casualties of dead and wounded during the fighting around Sollum and Halfaya Pass in June, it was high time to ferry in replacements from Germany. So, leaving our private quarters in late June, our whole detachment was put on trains and sent across the Alps and through all of Italy to Tarrant. When we arrived there, the surprise was great. In front of us in the harbour were 3 huge cruise ships. Full of astonishment, we learned the names of the 3 giants, Oceania, Neptunia, and Marco Polo. The ships Oceania and Neptunia were 2 sister ships grossing around 20,000 gross registered tonnage each. It was agreed with the Italians that each crossing was to consist of half German and half Italian troops and supplies each. The ships were actually passenger ships which had been converted to troop ships. For this purpose, they had been equipped with 105mm guns for submarine defence at the bow and stern, and 20mm twin flak guns against air attack distributed over the whole ship. With mixed feelings we went on board. On deck, while we already received life jackets, rumours quickly spread, and we learned that the Mediterranean was teeming with British submarines. Just in April, a complete convoy consisting of 5 freighters was destroyed by those. Altogether, more than 1,500 soldiers and sailors had drowned. This didn't necessarily comfort us. Once on board, we witnessed the ships being loaded. Thousands of soldiers like us were streaming on board, and heavy cranes lifted all sorts of goods packed in large crates, but also vehicles and guns on board to disappear in the ships' bellies. There was an incredible amount of activity, and with interest we observed the Italian dock workers, who carried out the loading with a lot of gesticulation, but skillfully. At the onset of the evening, we got to our bunks lying as tight as sardines in a can. After one night inside the cramped ship, we departed on the next day. On deck, leaning against the railing, we watched the spectacle unfold. Ahead of us, our escort, consisting of some sleek Italian destroyers, began to move, and our converted cruise ships followed lumberingly. One lonely German Ju-88 warplane appeared in the sky to spot surfacing submarine in time to warn our Italian companions. The ship started going on a zigzag course for increased safety. After some time, we went on to befriending the Italian anti-aircraft gun crews. They immediately proved to be very approachable. To overcome the language barrier, we tried communicating with hands and feet, as the German saying goes. They let us man the guns, and soon we eagerly performed targeting practice. Patting each other's backs, we managed to ease the tension. We found our Italian allies to be quite nice fellows who told us about their homeland with a lot of emotion in their voice. The tension during departure as well was our training on those anti-aircraft guns was soon replaced by the monotony of travel overseas. However, and after a chilly breeze had set in, we eventually decided to go below deck, where we also spent the night. The next day, nothing but the same thing, with nothing happening. Finally, we reached Tripoli harbour, Libya, after 2 days at sea without special incidents. Upon arrival in Tripoli, we were immediately charmed by the Mediterranean coastal city. Flat-roofed houses with tall minarets in between dominated the townscape. The shore was flat and the streets framed by palm trees. In the harbour there was a frenzy of activity in expectation of our ship's arrival. Something that also welcomed us immediately, however, was incredible heat. Having not felt its full force at sea thanks to a cool salt breeze, the sun was beating down on us relentlessly as soon as we slowed down to enter the harbour. We began sweating inside our uniforms, and the sweat ran into our eyes below our uniform caps. Immediately the unloading commenced. We went ashore and assembled in front of the harbour office building, where trucks were already standing ready for us. There I saw the distinctive symbol of the German Afrika Korps for the first time, a palm tree with the trunk halved by the swastika. Both were simply painted onto the former field grey doors, with the whole truck around them being hastily covered in sand-coloured paint. Disembarking from the ship and carrying our gear was already enough to cover us in sweat. We quickly realised that any unnecessary movement was to be avoided, but to no avail the tail lifts were dropped. We started loading and eventually mounted the trucks. The ride commenced, and instantly we discovered another inconvenience, even worse than the heat: dust. It got to us on the load bed from the sides as well as from behind, and everyone rummaged around for a handkerchief to hastily tie around mouth and nose. Our ride led through Tripoli and along a straight asphalt road eastward. Upon leaving the harbour, we saw the first locals populating the streets in their customary attire. We also noticed veiled women for the first time. Donkeys and a few camels strolled by on the street and were enveloped by our cloud of dust. After some time, we reached Kilometre 5. Kilometre 5 was the name of the reception and acclimatization camp established in the desert. Being located in the desert roughly 5 kilometres 3 miles east of Tripoli, it was named that way for a lack of any nearby prominent terrain feature. This camp was now to be our home for the first days in Africa. Here I also received the news that from now on I was assigned to headquarters company of Panzerjäger Abteilung 33 as a driver and messenger. Our first mission as newbies was to get accustomed to the climate of the theatre of operations, as well as familiarise with the carpool. The first days went by smoothly. We established contact with other German soldiers who had been here for longer and tried drawing from their experience and, most of all, to hear the latest news from the front lines. Sollum and Halfaya Pass had been defended successfully, and the latest reports indicated the British being on the retreat. I immediately noticed how faithfully the soldiers were talking about Rommel. His vigorous decision-making after he first arrived in Africa had found much appreciation among the lower ranks, and the victories achieved had convinced them of his skill as a leader. The entire Afrika Korps was in high spirits after it managed to beat the British and sent it into the desert. Our units had developed into a powerful force with great morale. Rommel and his officers were leading from the front, a fact thanks to which many important decisions could be made without delay. As a sign of affiliation, the Afrika Korps armband was introduced for all men of the German Afrika Korps, a strip of fabric with the word Afrika Korps stitched in silver on a green background, which every soldier was wearing on his lower left sleeve. This, of course, contributed to a sense of unity among the men, and everyone, including me, proudly wore that stripe on his uniform. Any Italians we encountered were also regaining some visible confidence. Here, the difference between officers, non-commissioned officers, and enlisted men was greater, especially when it came to morale and fighting spirit. While our officers, non-commissioned officers, and enlisted men all shared the same rations, the Italian army handled this very differently. They had 4 different kinds of menu, strictly divided into officer, sergeant, non-commissioned officer, and enlisted men rations. Officers were served 3-course meals, while the lowest ranks often suffered from starvation. We were surprised to find that the humble soldier was not considered to be of much worth in the Italian army. This helped us better understand the reports of lacking combat prowess of our southern allies. There were exceptions to be pointed out as well, however, and time and again we heard stories of Italian soldiers showing great courage during the bitter fighting in June. The different alignments among the Italians were also interesting to me. There were followers of Mussolini as well as the Italian king. Men aligned with Il Duce were fighting more doggedly, while men true to the king somewhat lacked enthusiasm in the field. All of them admired us Germans, however, and I had heard that when the Italians were fighting directly at our side, their fighting spirit improved considerably. Back in the military camp, the daily challenges of the desert climate embraced us again. Soon we got to know several annoying fellows, sand fleas, scorpions, as well as sand vipers and adders. The camp's close surroundings featured expansive cactus fields which were home to all kinds of creatures. Sand fleas and scorpions proved to be the most annoying. The camp was made up of barracks and tents erected right on the desert soil. Consequently, we had to welcome various guests on the floor every morning. Every day, soldiers were stung by scorpions and had to be treated at the medic's tent. So we quickly developed a habit of tying our shoes' shafts closed after doffing them in the evening or shaking them out in the morning. This applied to all things and items in general which were left unattended for a short while. All kinds of wildlife could have crawled inside. In addition, the sun was of course very discomforting. If we were to deploy to the front lines right after arriving, we probably would have collapsed after a short while. Acclimatization was of utmost necessity and importance. We realized that in the midday sun, every kind of movement was excruciating, and that the interior of any vehicle became as hot as an oven. Water was to be consumed at any opportunity in order to avoid dehydration. Here in the rear echelon, behind the front line, there was still enough of it. Providing some form of shade, be it by putting up tarpaulins or camo netting, was paramount and our highest priority during every rest and at the beginning of every short stop. Our desert equipment unfortunately proved to be of limited adequacy to these conditions. The uniforms had been designed based on experiences in German colonies during World War I. However, they were mostly unfit for use in the Libyan desert. Unlike British uniforms, which were made from wool, ours were made from cotton. This meant that they were cold at night, gave warmth during the day, and absorbed humidity in the morning. Only our high boots proved highly useful against sharp thorns and spikes of dry desert vegetation. The tropical helmet, which had seemed very handsome back in Germany, soon turned out unsuitable. The combination caps that were handed out were much more practical. Once in combat, you would wear your steel helmet to fend off shrapnel. As time went on, everyone collected his own custom inventory of varying uniform parts, ranging from British shorts to Wehrmacht coats and Italian uniform jackets. Our superiors, who had to endure the exact same hardships, graciously turned a blind eye to their men becoming more and more colourful. At first, however, we had to make do with the uniforms we had brought with us from Germany. We soon commenced trading a wide variety of uniform parts with Italian soldiers. To have more water available, an additional canteen proved very useful too. These aluminium flasks, if you were lucky, were covered in soft felt which could be soaked in order to keep the inside cool through evaporation. Additionally, everyone soon had a good scarf to protect against dust, as well as sunglasses to help with bright sunlight. Being in this life-hostile environment made us learn quickly. Baptism of Fire. In July 1941, I made my first long supply trip from Tripoli to Sollum. Half-track vehicles, which were mainly used as tractors for our light anti-tank guns, had also come with us. These had proved themselves in the hot climate without any problems. During pauses, the column was spaced out very far to offer no concentrated target, while at night we went in close formation to make the escort job easier, as well as reducing the chance of someone getting left behind in the desert, which had happened several times before. More than just a few German and Italian soldiers were swallowed up by the desert during the fighting in North Africa, never to be seen again. German and Italian field engineers had constructed a roughly 80 kilometres, 50 miles, long road circumventing the siege of Tobruk, so the only thing we noticed while bypassing the scene was the thundering rumble of artillery duels raging around the town. Also of note was the border between Libya and Egypt, which was demarcated by 50 kilometres or 30 miles, long fence of barbed wire starting at the coast, crossing the road, and then leading into the desert. After our arrival at Solom and unloading, I was ordered to report to the command post of Panzerjäger Abteilung 33. It consisted of one of the flat buildings typical for the region and a few tents. I reported and was immediately sent directly to one of the officers. He was standing in front of a tent talking to some non-commissioned officers. By his shoulder pieces I recognized him as an Oberleutnant, first lieutenant. I stood to attention and reported, "Lieutenant, Private Höhler reporting as ordered." He looked me over and said, "Höhler, very good. My name is Lieutenant Mader. I am a staff officer for special deployment. I've been informed you're my new driver?" "Yes, Lieutenant," I confirmed. "Very well. In the fighting of the last weeks I lost my messenger. From now on you are assigned to me and thus my new attendant. Report to the Kraftfahroffizier, motor pool officer. He will assign you to a motorcycle. Welcome to the front, Höhler," he said and shook my hand. In light of this friendly gesture I must have looked quite surprised, because the non-commissioned officers who had listened to our conversation were all smiling. So this was it. From now on I was a Krad messenger for the staff of Panzerjäger Abteilung 33. The staff essentially enabled the detachment's commander to lead his force. It also had several messengers like me. This assignment meant that I would not return to Tripoli, but rather stay here. Very well, I thought. Now I won't have to endure the long journey back, and also I was eager to get to the front lines. My first impression of First Lieutenant Mader had been of a positive nature, and sergeants as well as non-commissioned officers seemed likeable. The motor pool officer gave me a short briefing and noted my data in case my relatives needed to be informed of my demise. He also showed me my new quarters for the time being, a small tent on the desert floor. The ground had not been prepared much, just a few layers of rocks had been piled up in a circle around the tent. "Against the shrapnel," the officer proclaimed. From a non-commissioned officer who was responsible for the staff's vehicles, I received my machine, a heavy BMW with a sidecar. I parked it right in front of my tent, fully fueled, to be ready at a moment's notice. My Kar 98 carbine I swapped for an MP40 submachine gun, which was handier and less of an inconvenience while driving. It was easy to handle, but I was told to maintain it with special care in this dusty desert climate, which meant cleaning it over and over again and oiling it as little as possible. Oil absorbed the dust, causing unwelcome jamming, not the best of things to happen when face to face with the enemy. Close to our camp was one of the 3 anti-tank companies. Its assortment of vehicles and ordnance was not bad at all. The Pak 35-36 that I knew well formed its main armament, for which there were half-track tractors, Leichter Zugkraftwagen Sonderkraftfahrzeug 10, available. In addition, I spotted a few Opel Blitz trucks, Horch medium personnel transports, as well as several VW Kubelwagen off-road cars, called Kubel. Over the following days I familiarised myself with the Solom area, getting to know some other men of the detachment as well. They hailed from all kinds of places, even Ostmarkers like me were among them, which stirred up some home-like feelings. The 3 anti-tank platoons of the company close to us were deployed at the pass roads near Solom as well as Halfaya Pass, a focus of anti-tank capability between the infantry of I Battalion, Schützen Regiment 104, 104th Rifle Regiment. These soldiers had captured the pass in May 1941 and in June. They had successfully defended it against British tank attacks. The successful defence had been made possible by the use of several 88mm anti-aircraft gun batteries in the Sollum area. As I found out, those heavy gun batteries belonged to the first detachments of either Flak Regiment 18, Anti-Aircraft Regiment 18, as well as Flak Regiment 33. Talking to other soldiers, I learned that Flak Regiment 18 had been deployed for combat in Africa after moving over Sicily from its home garrison in Wiener Neustadt, Ostmark. Their positions were well fortified, and their crews were full of confidence owing to their recent success against the British heavy tanks. All in all, the batteries deployed had disabled 91 British tanks. Soon I was ordered to report at the detachment command post, ready to start. First Lieutenant Mader was already waiting for me. "Well, Höhler, up to the front it is. Today we're going to inspect our detachment's furthermost positions. Just take us where I point to, I already know the way by heart," he said. Off we went, racing away. As he had announced, he pointed in some direction and we raced through the desert, passing dunes of sand and rocks shaped into bizarre patterns by the wind. Time and again I looked to the edge of my goggles to take a peek at my passenger in the sidecar. Despite the darkness setting in more and more, he seemed perfectly confident that the direction we were heading was correct. Eventually we reached our positions at Halfaya Pass. The sun had already sunk below the horizon, leaving behind a twilight in the sky. The only sign of having reached our destination was the fact that the first lieutenant ordered me to halt. As we were standing there, the engine chugging away idling, and I took a hard look through the dusty goggles into the dark, I spotted a silhouette parting from the rocks and closing in purposefully. It was our contact. I felt relieved and secretly admired the first lieutenant for his sense of direction. Thanks to months of experience in the North African desert, he had found the way to the forward positions almost blindly. Our front line essentially consisted of drawn-out anti-tank gun, machine gun and infantry positions nestling to the plateau's edge. A serpentine road led from the coast below up to the plateau. Halfaya Pass was the opening between the two. In the bright moonlight I had a fantastic view from the edge. One could clearly make out the sea. I reckoned that during the day this elevated area would be unbearably hot. In our positions I recognised the familiar PAK 35-36 as well as MG 34 carriages. The dugouts were surrounded by walls of piled-up stones and only little actual digging had taken place. The rocky ground was simply too hard to get deep. The soldiers' tents were close by, utilising each and every depression in the ground to protect against shrapnel. There was no artificial source of light to be seen, the front-line men blending into the surrounding rocks and dry bushes. Immediately, the first lieutenant began checking on each position. Following him, I seized the opportunity to speak to soldiers from the company. They were quite welcoming and asked what was new in nearby Sollum. Well, me as a newcomer had little to talk about, so they told me about the fierce battle they had made it through in June, just a few weeks ago. We were on our way to the next position as a sudden thunder tore through the air, followed by a surging rustle. We halted and I looked at my first lieutenant, who in turn looked at me. With his jaw dropped as if gasping for air, he screamed, "Take cover!" Arms ahead, I leaped as quickly as possible behind the nearest boulder, and just then the impacts commenced. With loud bangs, the enemy artillery shells detonated amidst our positions. Immediately the area was illuminated as bright as day from all the explosion flashes. There were so many detonations in such a short time that it sounded like a relentlessly coherent, deafening roar. With a bright flash, a shell went down less than 20 metres ahead, and I could feel the shockwave generated by the blast. There was loud whirring all around, and I realised that its cause was shrapnel virtually filling the air. I observed red-hot splinters hitting nearby rocks, coming to rest in the sand and smoking. All of this took mere seconds and was over as fast as it had begun. After a moment of absolute silence, painful screaming tore through the night, followed closely by cries for a medic. You could hear the shock in this shrill voice. The screams were coming out of the darkness immediately ahead. From the position that we wanted to visit next, a semblance of curses, "We have casualties," flashed through my mind. Since we could not hear any more gunfire, the first lieutenant and I sprang up and ran towards the position ahead. It was a horrific scene, which was only bearable thanks to the dark. Medics were already at the site, trying to save what was left to save under a dim flashlight. The medics struggled to rescue the wounded and fallen soldiers. 2 maimed bodies lay motionless, while a third was writhing in pain, sobbing convulsively. The smell of burnt powder filled the air, and only a twisted wreck remained in the anti-tank gun position. 2 men had been killed instantly. 1 had been badly wounded by shrapnel. The British shell had hit the 3.7 centimetres anti-tank gun's position directly, as well as its unfortunate crew in the nearby tent. A lucky shot for the Brits, a disaster for the gun crew. The low rock wall had not offered enough protection, so that the tent was simply blown away. I was standing at the site, taken aback by the sight. As the first lieutenant was energetically directing the rescue efforts, I tried to help bring the wounded to the back into a safer area. That went quite fast, I thought to myself. One moment we were chatting under a quiet dome of stars. The next we were caught by the reality of war and its utter cruelty. I found myself shaking a bit once the adrenaline started fading. This fire attack had caught me red-handed, while it had also been my trial of fire, although I had had different expectations of the latter. The following weeks went by smoothly. British artillery strikes became somewhat of a routine, and yes, one could actually get used to them. Only rarely did a shell hit one of our positions directly in the way I had witnessed. Most of them detonated at some distance away, which of course was anything but harmless. Each shell created a downpour of shrapnel. Our own artillery answered only rarely, namely once a British position or battery had been clearly identified. We did not have enough ammunition to fire off blindly in the general direction of the enemy. For the most part, the purpose of both sides' artillery fire was to not give the opponent any peace, as well as disrupting enemy activity. As always, the military had a term for this: Stur oder Strafruhr, harassing fire or zone fire. In mid-August of 1941, we were redeployed from Upper to Lower Sollum, closer to the coast. Lower Sollum's main feature was its large wadi, a wide dried-out riverbed leading into a large bay on the coast. This area would provide additional protection against the British long-range artillery fire. The wadi also offered more green than the plateau, and with great joy we discovered some fig trees bearing ripe fruits. Fishing at sea was also possible, and we did so with minimal effort. We would simply throw a hand grenade into the water, let it detonate, and then gather the fish killed by the shock wave. Fruits and fish were a welcome improvement of our rations. Food, rations, and fresh water were a thing of their own altogether. Most of the food consisted of all kinds of canned fodder, all possible kinds. Very often sardines in oil, which in the heat often agitated one's stomach. Usually we also drank the oil to get some additional hydration. In addition, those canned sardines were a barter good coveted by the Bedouins, who gave us pumpkins, dates, or other fruit in return. Italian rations were also part of the daily menu, which mostly consisted of AM cans. We sarcastically called them Armer Mussolini, poor Mussolini. Up to this day I have no idea what AM actually stood for. They contained fibrous donkey meat, as well as rock-hard cheese and crisp bread, and of course sand, which always found its way into the mouth, grinding between the teeth. In the newsreels they showed how in the searing heat eggs were cooked on the steel plating of our tanks. That may very well have been possible, as it was clearly hot enough, but I cannot say for sure, since I never saw a single egg in all of Africa. On that same note, I hardly saw any of our tanks in the summer of 1941. So we entertained ourselves by painting white Balkenkreuzer on the back of turtles we found near the sea. I wonder if the British found any of them during their later advance in November, and if so, what they may have thought of their discovery. Water was always in short supply, or what was there was salty. Coffee, for example, was brewed with salt water. It tasted awful, but one got used to it. But the thirst grew more and more, and I caught myself daydreaming about drinking from the cold, clear water of the Saubach stream, springing from the foot of Mount Schneeberg back at home, where we used to catch trout as kids. This happened at night too. You would reach for your full canteen to take a sip, but it never became real. We later learned a handy trick from the Italians. They put a dash of anise schnapps in their canteens. This made the water taste terrible, but the taste of anise covered up the sensation of thirst for a while. Word of this soon got around, and anise schnapps became hard to get. Water from the wells, which often lay close to the sea, was often salty as well. Many of us paid for this prolonged dehydration in later years with kidney stones. This happened to me too. After a few months, almost everyone was suffering from chronic inflammation of the kidneys and gastroenteritis. Profuse sweating during the daytime left crusts of salt on the uniform. This was exacerbated on the rare occasions when we took a bath in the sea, or when we washed our uniforms in the seawater. The salt remained in the uniform's fabric. In the cold nights, a salt-rich uniform drew humidity from the sea breeze, which soon made for a wet uniform you had to wear in the cool night. The consequences were colds as well as inflammations of kidney and bladder. Everyone wore something extra around their belly at night, but colds and diarrhea were still a common problem. Oftentimes people would carry a spade with them to dig a small hole before relieving themselves. This was quite important, as it prevented infectious germs from getting spread by wind and dust. But sometimes one of the men had such a sudden urge that he did not have any time to dig a hole, or even drop his trousers. Getting said trousers clean again without water available was another story. The Bedouins taught us to wash ourselves with sand. People had watery diarrhea for weeks or even months on end. This was caused not by the aforementioned hypothermia, but mostly by the widespread dysentery. Once you had that, it was hard to get rid of. Your condition deteriorated and the immune system weakened more and more. As if that was not enough, your liver would soon take its toll. By the end of summer, almost everyone at the front suffered from jaundice. You could see it in your comrades' eyes. We attributed our bad health to the rations and permanent inflammations within our lower bodies. I languished so much that I was almost brought to my knees. But there was not much to do about it. Those who fell and would not stand up again were brought to the sick bay, while the rest held their positions in more or less of a good condition. In August 1941, there were signs everywhere that our own offensive was being prepared for. First rumours came up saying that Rommel planned attacking at the next opportunity. Only a shortage of supplies had forced him to bide his time for so long. Despite all early victories, he had to accept that his next attack had to be deferred. In the meantime, more and more new materiel had been brought to the front. We received new, stronger Pak-38 anti-tank guns, which fired 50mm rounds instead of the old 37mm ones. The shells themselves had been developed to promise success even against thickly armoured fighting vehicles. The new guns were somewhat larger than the old Pak-35-36, weighing a little over 900 kilograms. Their range was already over 9,000 metres. While you could not effectively track any target at that distance, the higher muzzle velocity leading to this maximum range improved the accuracy at medium distances. Over 1,000 metres away, their armour-piercing shells were still able to penetrate almost 50mm of steel. Those were good prospects when targeting British Matilda and Crusader tanks. Initially, one of our 3 platoons was equipped with 4 Par-38. We all commenced training with those guns immediately, and straight away noticed the difference in weight of almost 600 kilograms. The number of men in each gun crew was increased, and training hours were mostly in the evening, when moving around was more bearable thanks to lower temperatures. In combat, every man had to do his part, which meant that in a pinch the messengers were expected to also be able to handle an anti-tank gun. It was mid-August 1941, one early evening when we were just visiting one of the positions, when suddenly the alarms were sounded. One of our observation posts had detected suspicious movement. All tensed up, we gazed into the desert ahead. The gun crews were readying shells, and the clacking of ammo crates revealed that the MG positions were preparing for an assault as well. The first lieutenant's presence had a reassuring effect on the men. After some time, with the sun already setting, he decided to send a scouting party towards where the movement was supposed to have been detected. A short briefing followed. Some men left our forward positions and vanished in the twilight. Anxiously, we waited. Meda readied his flare gun and its ammo so he could light up the field ahead in the event of a firefight. Finally, after what seemed like forever, it was reported that the scouting party had returned. Darkness had already set in, and we had feared the worst. Upon returning, however, they brought a big surprise with them: 4 captured Englishmen. They had been ordered to recon our positions, and one of them had slipped off a rock, injuring his leg badly, perhaps even breaking it. This fall, along with the resulting unusual movement through what should have been motionless desert, was then detected by our observation post. The British had planned to wait for darkness and then bring their injured comrade back to their own lines, but our scouting party had caught them by surprise. They were so occupied with rescuing their comrade that they did not notice our men approaching. Even with the help of our soldiers, together all of them took a substantial amount of time to reach our lines. The prisoners were brought to a tent and subject to a first interrogation by Meda. This gave me plenty of time to have a good look at our opponents. To my surprise, they looked just like us. Well, what had I expected? An English lord, strolling around the desert with cane and bowler hat. Even their uniforms were similar to ours. Only their distinctive flat Brodie helmets and knee-high stockings gave them a different appearance. They looked quite exhausted and gratefully accepted the water we offered. The fellow with a broken leg was in great pain. One could see that he was barely able to keep his composure. The medics did their best to bring him into a more comfortable position, but mostly in vain. After some time, the interrogation had just ended, and the first lieutenant wanted to organise the prisoners' transportation. The radio in a neighbouring tent sounded the well-known song of Lili Marleen. Vor der Kaserne, bei dem großen Tor, stand eine Laterne und steht sie noch davor. So wollen wir uns wiedersehen. Bei der Laterne wollen wir stehen, wie einst Lili Marleen. Outside the barracks, by the corner light. I'll always stand and wait for you at night. We will create a world for two. I'll wait for you the whole night through. For you, Lili Marleen. All of us went silent, and the British began humming along softly. Their leader, a sergeant, bid the first lieutenant to wait until the song's end. Meda nodded, and so we all raptly listened to the whole song. And for the first time, in this frankly incidental and harmless situation, exhausted, tired, and face-to-face with the enemy, I asked myself if this war we were fighting made sense. I was smitten by these events and felt an unprecedented connection to the British. There they were sitting now, young fellows, just as gaunt and weary as us, but just as full of dreams. In this moment, all of us were closer to each other than ever before. In fact, that song was something special. Sung by Leila Anderson in 4 verses, Lili Marleen had become famous on both sides of the front, such that the British had translated it to English using the same melody. Each day, shortly before 10 p.m, it was aired on all German military stations to wrap up the day's broadcast. These could also be received by the British, of course. Whenever the circumstances permitted, each of us tried to not miss that moment. The radios were set to the according frequency, and for a few minutes all of us had their heads anywhere but in the war. If one was to walk through the camp then, the song would softly sound from every tent, every dugout, every tank and every command vehicle. Oftentimes I would see someone with tears in their eyes, which some would hastily wipe away when they felt caught. The song stirred up feelings of longing and touching sentiment opposed to the unbearably dreadful reality all around. We never had any artillery strikes or any other kind of attack during this time. It was a kind of unofficial ceasefire. This may seem glorifying to today's reader, but in times of war there are countless such incidents. Some happenstance that for a short while unites all parties involved in common longing for home and family, just to continue slaughtering each other shortly thereafter with the same old hatred and vigour. Unplanned departure. In late August 1941, Rommel decided to capture the fortress of Tobruk, which was still occupied by the British and stuck like a thorn in our side, once and for all. The British had built up the city's defences further, and even managed to reinforce it by sea with men and materiel despite fiercer German air attacks. So, starting in early September, Rommel tried to tighten the noose around Tobruk. His headquarters were relocated to Gazala, to the west of Tobruk, and commenced preparations for the assault. Since attacking from Halfaya Pass eastwards toward Cairo was not feasible, then at least the important harbour of Tobruk was to be captured. Rommel had used all arriving supplies to continually reinforce active combat formations. Consequentially, the 5th Leichter Division was transformed into the 21st Panzer Division in August. This division was to decide my fate over the course of the war. With the 1st Panzer Division as well as the 21st Panzer Division, Rommel had 2 full armoured divisions in addition to the Italian ones in the African theatre of war by late summer 1941. He seemed to have enough forces available to dare the risky attack. In mid-September, during the preparations for this offensive, our detachment was ordered to hand over our positions to other units in order to support the planned attack. Our journey led us to the east of Tobruk. We were happy to notice that this was once again close to the sea. Here we took up positions between the coast and Via Balbia. If the assault on Tobruk was to be successful, the British were expected to attempt a breakout towards the east, which would make them run into our anti-tank gunfire, leading to their ultimate destruction. First Lieutenant Mader took care to survey our planned positions with appropriate diligence. The companies quickly dug in, and 88mm flak guns were also deployed in our area once again. Something that benefited us during the build-up of our positions there was the fact that we had absolute air supremacy. Unlike around Sollum and Halfaya Pass, we did not have to watch out for British fighter and fighter-bomber planes. On the contrary, we could witness our Stukas drop bombs on Tobruk almost all day long. For us on the ground, such a dive bomber attack was always a sight to behold. When the Tobruk perimeter had been tightened, the area we later deployed to had seen intense fighting. I discovered multiple provisional graves, but also something just as gruesome. A few of the graves had been scavenged by jackals. Because of the hard ground, the graves were quite shallow, so they were covered with piles of rock to keep the carrion feeders from consuming the dead. Those carrion feeders were really tenacious, however, digging through to the remains. Time and again these desert jackals were roving about near the graves, trying to reach the decomposing corpses, scratching and scraping. The rocky terrain offered them plenty of hiding spots. On their search for something to eat, they would daringly sneak up on us, only driven off by having rocks thrown at them. Most unnerving, however, was their typical howling at night. On guard duty at night, this could become quite annoying. I was no exception to this, and during these lonely nights I thought with consternation about the graves of the fallen, who could not find peace even in death. Already during the transfer from Sollum to the Tobruk area, I noticed that something was wrong with me. The usual exhaustion had intensified for me. I was even more tired than usual, and now, at the Tobruk front line, the first attacks of fever and diarrhea were coming. My fever got worse and worse, eventually rising to 40 degrees centigrade, 104 degrees Fahrenheit. I was just barely able to stand. and so our medic decided to have me admitted to the hospital. High fever, abdominal pain and diarrhea led him to suspect typhoid fever. In addition, I showed clear signs of jaundice. When he informed me of his decision, I was shocked. I didn't want to leave my comrades and go into the uncertainty of a military hospital stay. This typhoid disease, a kind of bacterial infection, I only knew from hearsay. Now I was to have it. However, our medic was convinced and described what drastic consequences an outbreak of the disease in our unit could have, and so, totally exhausted as I was, I surrendered to my fate.